Our subject tonight, of course, is United States Syrian. Our topic tonight is U.S. Syrian relations, which is an extraordinarily interesting topic at this time, although Syria seems to be extraordinarily interesting no matter when you turn your attention to it. We're always pleased when someone of the ambassador's stature is able to be with us to cope with that kaleidoscope of interests and behaviors which we find in the Middle East. Our program, by the way, tonight is off the record. There will be no attribution by members of the press to the ambassador directly, and there will be no quotes from this evening's session. The ambassador is one of those extraordinarily well-trained State Department officers in the area of his specialization. Most of his assignments have, in fact, been in the Middle East. He has a Bachelor of Arts degree from Yale University. He studied at the Institute of Political Science in Paris, and later in his career at the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton. His first assignment, one of his first assignments, after joining the Foreign Service in 1949, interestingly, was as political officer in Damascus. In the years after that, he had several assignments in Iran and Iraq. He has gone to language school to study the Arabic language in Beirut, and I believe in Tunisia, and at the Foreign Service Institute in Washington. He served as chief of the U.S. Interest Section in Algiers, in charge of the affairs in Tripoli. He was chief of the U.S. Interest Sections in Baghdad before being appointed in October of 1984 to his present position as United States Ambassador to Syria. His experience speaks for itself. It's a great pleasure to have with us this evening and to welcome the Ambassador of the United States to Syria, Mr. William Eagleton.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm most happy to be here in this great city and this beautiful location. If my discourse seems to wander, it's probably because I'm taken in by the view and lose train of thought. But we'll try to keep it organized until we get to the questions, which is the main part of this evening, I hope. We're looking for a lively exchange. I did ask that this be off the record because I thought we could get into it much more deeply and much more frankly if the remarks were not for publication. There are different types of presentations that you get from the State Department. There are those who come from areas either geographic or functional in which it is desired and desirable to get some sort of message out to the wider public, and so those usually come in the form of a speech, and it is hoped that the local press will pick it all up. Well, Syria is not one of the subjects that lends itself to that kind of a presentation. The relationship between the United States and Syria has always been a delicate and fragile one, and since I am still the ambassador to Syria, although resident in Washington, I do have to watch what I say for publication. Before turning to Syria, I do have a brief intervention from our sponsor. If you have had anyone else here from the State Department recently, perhaps you've had the same message. I've never detected so much concern and almost panic in Washington in the foreign affairs establishment over budgetary questions. So this message is really that the amount of money that is being put, of federal money being put into the foreign affairs field has been reduced arbitrarily, along with other budgets these last several years, and it has now gotten to the point where we are not keeping our commitments in a number of parts of the world. I won't talk about the problems of the State Department itself. The State Department is a fraction of that budget, and most of it is foreign aid. And a lot of it is earmarked by Congress in such a way that leaves no flexibility. You probably know that Israel and Egypt received the biggest chunk of that aid. I think it's almost 30%. Then when you cut it, but without cutting those aid levels, a 20% cut, for instance, can mean a 50% or 60 or 70% cut for somebody else. And in some of these countries, we have American bases. Spain, the cut was 70%, I was told. So you can see that a first-class power that we know we are is beginning to operate on a second, in some places, third-class level. So I was asked, as everybody else in the State Department is asked, to pass this on to you for whatever you might want to do with it. I have to report later what the reaction is. I will say I got a laugh. But it is serious. Now, let's have a serious reaction. That's right. All right, here we are with Syria. And what I'm going to do now is give a kind of an introduction which will perhaps answer some of the more obvious questions, a little background, and then we will go right into the question period. Syria occupies a very important geographic position. It is a geographic position that gives it its main importance to us and to the Middle East. More so than economic power, for instance, or even military power, although the military power is not negligible in relative terms. Looking at the Middle East as a whole, that is the Arab Middle East, Syria is not quite in the front rank. I would list the three front-ranked countries, or top-ranked in terms of power, as Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq. In the case of Egypt, of course, the vast population, Saudi Arabia, the vast wealth, Iraq, a country which until the war was able to dispose of considerable wealth from oil and has some agricultural areas and, although not a huge population, a growing and rather dynamic population. Syria is just a notch below, one might say. A slightly smaller population than Iraq. We're talking Iraq, 15 million, Syria, 12 or 11. No great oil reserves or production, but some, a little bit, almost subsistence. A relatively good agricultural sector, but no great money earner. And as I said, the military power is relatively strong, but of course not a real threat, most of the days, to the neighbor Israel. Syria has had some difficulty finding its definition and its vocation. The old maps during the Ottoman times placed Syria in a rather vague area of the eastern Mediterranean, the Levant, always including Lebanon, what we now call Lebanon, and sometimes part of what we call Palestine. There have been Syrian parties and political leaders who look toward a greater Syria. One party even extending this to include Iraq and Cyprus. But the heartland of Syria is what we now call the state of Syria. And an argument could be made that Lebanon is historically associated with it in some way, although always with a separate identity. Syria was an important country throughout history, largely, again, because of its geographic position. The empires and the armies tended to march back and forth through Syria. Egypt on one side, Mesopotamia on the other, that is Iraq, with the Anatolian plateau often having strong military powers, Hittites and so on. Whereas Syria itself was not a power of that magnitude. But many battles took place there. Of course, the Romans were well entrenched in Syria. That was after a Greek period, even during the Roman era, the Greek language was widely used. The high point for Syria, as for Damascus, probably came just after the Muslim conquest, when the dynasty of the Arab world, the Umayyads, was centered in Damascus and remained in power in a large area stretching from Iran to the Atlantic Ocean for 100 years. Well, this doesn't really have much influence right now. This past, there are Syrians who point to the past, but I think to talk about modern Syria, we have to think in terms of the late Ottoman period, World War I, World War II, and of course what has followed. The French mandate, you will recall, ended in 1946 with Syria's independence. Initially, Syria, like some other countries in the Middle East, tried a pluralistic type of democracy. Free press, political parties, and so on. Well, some of us look back on that with a certain nostalgia. It was great fun being there in those days because you had a lot of personalities and a lot was going on. But there were many defects in the system. The press, although free, was not free from influence of various types. A lot of almost blackmail was used in reporting. Small newspapers would malign somebody or some party just for the purpose of attracting money in order to shut them up. The political parties didn't have a lot of grassroots support. They were organized around major families and commercial interests. That is up until the beginning of the 50s. Then the military took over. And Syria became the prototype for the coup d'etat in the Middle East. Again, we can look back with nostalgia because these early coup d'etats were rather civilized affairs. One section of the army would take over the army would put the politicians in prison. By that time, the public was quite happy to see the politicians go into prison because they'd usually made a mess of it. And that would last until another faction took over, the losing faction going off as military attaches or perhaps ambassadors abroad. Now this process, almost folkloric type process, ended when some very serious parties came into being. These are parties based on the proposition that you can get power and you can hang on to it. And some of their structure was based on the communist experience, which has been quite successful in getting and hanging on to power, at least in the Soviet Union and later in Eastern Europe. The party that took power in Syria and in Iraq was the Ba'ath Party, the Socialist Resurrectionists, Ba'ath being the Arabic term for resurrectionists. And we won't go deeply into that history except to say that there were even coups within the Ba'ath, and finally through a process of elimination, eliminating different factions in the army, power was concentrated in the Ba'ath Party in the hands of a group of army officers who all came from the same part of the country. It was a rugged, rocky area north of Lebanon, a kind of a continuation of the Lebanese highlands, but not so high, called the Alawi or Nusayri territory. They were members of an heretical sect that had originally been part of Shia Islam. They had become dominant in the army because they didn't have much of anything else to do. The French had favored minorities as a way to keep the Sunni, that is the Orthodox Arab majority, under control. Syria is approximately something a little less than 80%, maybe 75% Sunni, with a Christian population divided among a number of Eastern churches of about 12% and an Alawi minority of the same. It's remarkable that this group, this minority, has been able to maintain its position so securely over these recent years. In fact, when one talks about a threat to it, you usually look for another faction from within the Alawite minority, or some other faction of army officers. Whether this can be sustained historically over decades is another question. And I think there might be some doubt about that. Now, the Ba'ath Party, with Hafiz al-Assad at its head, is kept in power by, first of all, the elimination of opposition, but with an interlocking group of security agencies. Every Arab country has a security arm, internal security, but the Syrians have 4 of them. And they watch each other and they watch other areas of possible opposition. Sometimes they become involved overseas, outside Syria, carrying their vendettas to Europe, often vendettas of one Arab, one Syrian against another, and spilling over at times into what we refer to as international terrorism, and that is a subject we'll get to. Assad himself he's a man who's managed to hang on longer than most. And he is a tough, intelligent, and serious person. He is cautious. He's a man of his word, relatively. But I don't belittle that. Among statesmen, he stands out for that. Now you put these attributes together, and you can get something that you could call stubbornness, if you want to be negative about it. If you take a man who's fixed by his word and is cautious and so on, it's very hard to budge him from positions that he believes are the right ones. The policies of Syria are really the policies of Hafiz al-Assad. I don't mean that there is no input from anyplace else. He has his advisors, but he gives a special imprint on the policies. Any important decision is referred to him, and any unimportant decisions are referred to him. So when we talk about Syria, and Syria as an actor on the world stage, often we're simply talking about Hafiz al-Assad. So where does this leave the U.S. and Syria, this fragile, strange relationship? We've had problems in our relationship with Syria since the beginning. That doesn't mean it's all been downhill or that it's all been bad, but we have had periods of real tension, interrupted by periods of honeymoon. We had a period in the 50s when we were getting along quite well with the dictator of the time, Habib Shekli. And then a period of instability in Syria where we didn't know quite where we were. We were being accused, and I don't think there have been any strong official denials of interfering in Syrian internal affairs during that period. Our fingers were burned, and fortunately we learned some lessons from that. But we haven't found it easy to develop a sustained, positive relationship with any of the regimes, not just the regime of Hafiz al-Assad. We did have a bit of the last honeymoon came after the war of 1973, when we became the center of an effort to, well, first to stop the war, and then to bring some limited agreements into being, to draw new lines, or to establish what the situation would be, separating the different armies. At that time, the Syrians looked to us to help them remove the Israelis from at least a part of the Golan Heights, a part of Syria that had been seized by Israel in 1967. Kissinger's shuttle, great deal of effort, brought a small pullback, allowing the Syrians to say that after the war they had gained a slight bit of territory. They took over a completely destroyed town called Sinatra. After that, we put some money into Syria as an aid program to encourage them along the moderate path that they seem to be following. But unfortunately, that honeymoon era was interrupted by the later efforts to find a comprehensive Middle East peace, the so-called Camp David Agreement, which Syria considered to be a partial settlement, a private agreement to manage to attain what the Egyptians wanted, but removed Egypt from the confrontation and left the rest of the Arabs helpless and unable to negotiate their own agreements. Nevertheless, you saw that the architect of this agreement was just very, very warmly received by Syria, but again, we can discuss that later. Jimmy Carter's business. So the Congress, by 1983, was fed up with various things that Syria was doing, particularly in Lebanon, and cut off the aid, what remained unspent. The Syrians took that rather calmly, and we continued to pursue the dialogue that both the Syrian government and the United States government have considered to be important. There's too many things happening in that area for us not to be talking to each other. But with the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, the agreement brokered by the United States, the so-called May 17 agreement, which gave Israel a special position in Lebanon, all of that was anathema to Syria. We had confrontation, military problems, American planes shot down, battleships bombarding Syrian positions, and so on. Even so, the dialogue continued. But I would say relations remained on a rather even keel until developments of the past year. Now, Syria has been something of an odd man out in the Middle East. Syrian positions are often out of step not only with our own, which might be natural, but out of step with the other Arabs. Notably on the Iraq-Iran war. As you know, Syria sides with Iran against Iraq. On the question of the Palestinians, most Arabs still support the PLO under Yasser Arafat. Hafiz al-Assad will have nothing to do with Arafat. In fact, does everything he can to cause Arafat's problems. This is one of the reasons why Syria has harbored the most notorious of the terrorist groups, the Abu Nidal organization. Abu Nidal has, for a number of years, spent a lot of his time battling Arafat and his PLO. So that made Abu Nidal a natural ally of Syria. Well, I think that the questions and answers we'll get on the peace process, so I won't talk about that right now. But I should mention that Syria is not in a strong economic position. That is an understatement at the present time. Syria has suffered a great deal from the drop in oil prices, although not a large producer. Syria has benefited greatly from money being thrown around by the rich states of the Gulf, remittances from Syrian workers, businessmen coming through. All of that has dried up, and Syria's exchange problem is critical. The currency has declined considerably in value, and inflation is moving very fast clip, about 100% a year at the present time. So issues that we were talking about that we were discussing with Syria in the dialogue included the Gulf War. Well, we know their position, they know our position. We'd like to see it end. Lebanon, sometimes we found areas of agreement. The Syrians claim they would like to see a united and independent Lebanese government. That's always been our position. They want an end to the struggle there, an end to the fighting among the different confessional groups. We feel the same way about it. They, of course, would like a certain element of hegemony in Lebanon, and that is something that would have to be worked out between themselves and whoever is running Lebanon, or trying to. South Lebanon is another issue. Israel is still occupying a strip of South Lebanon, and that is a bone of contention. It's something that many of us feel is a gift to Assad. It gives him a way to rally certain forces that otherwise would be at each other's throats. It's a popular issue. Is attacking that zone, but we are sometimes in a position to play a role. We haven't found a solution, but it's a subject of legitimate dialogue between ourselves and Syria. The peace process, Syria fades in and out of the peace process. There's a well-known saying, I don't know who they most recently attributed to, that you can't make war without Egypt in the Middle East, you can't make peace without Syria. Well, that's a simplification. It's not entirely true because Egypt and Israel made peace without Syria. But by definition, you cannot have a comprehensive peace without Syria because Syria is part of the problem. So we have kept in touch with Syria. Assistant Secretary Murphy has frequently visited Syria, usually to discuss, among other things, the peace process at whatever stage it is. Another subject that we talked to the Syrians about was our hostages. Several years ago, it was widely believed that the Syrians were simply not trying to help with the hostages. If they wanted to, the popular belief when I first got to Syria, the popular belief in Washington was that Assad was holding back, that perhaps we should put some pressure to try to get him to do something. There are a lot of strange ideas circulating. It didn't take long, though, I think, for most people to be convinced that the Syrians simply didn't have the ability to get those hostages out. They would indeed like to, because it would greatly enhance their prestige to be able to do so. They don't believe in hostage-taking as a means of applying pressure. They're against that kind of lawlessness in Lebanon. But except in cases where hostages by some other means have fallen into their hands, in those cases they've been very helpful. They haven't been able to do anything, although they're getting closer now since they have moved deeper into Lebanon and deeper into West Beirut. They were very helpful at the time of the TWA hijacking in 1985. Had it not been for Syrians, and particularly the president, the vice president, and others working on it, I for one, do not know how long those passengers would have been sitting in Beirut. And I don't know what reaction this might have brought from our own government in Washington. How long could the administration have sustained that kind of thing? Everybody agreed that the nation should not go through another hostage situation of the type we had in Tehran. The Syrians moved in contact with us, moved very professionally and effectively to bring about a kind of a tacit arrangement that preserved our position, that we would not bargain for hostages. At the same time, it got the hostages out. The Syrians were very unhappy with the lack of gratitude that they received at that time, particularly from the highest levels of the U.S. government. That was because many people around in the White House in Washington this was not the end. The terrorists were still running amok in Lebanon. There was no guarantee that the Beirut airport wouldn't be used again for this kind of thing. So, although there was some happiness and gratitude, and there was some expression of thanks for the fact that Syria had played a role, there was a begrudging kind of thanks. It was one sort of saying, well, you were part of the problem, you solved it, okay, you did your duty, that's fine. Now let's get on and do some more. This led to a period during which our effort to enlist the Syrian help on the hostage issue did not make much progress. However, I doubt that the Syrians could have done anything anyway, even if they'd been inclined to do so at that time. Well, this brings us up to the rather dramatic events of October and November. You will recall that in April, I believe it was, of last year, a young lady from Ireland was stopped by the Israeli security people at Heathrow Airport and found to carry a bomb sufficient to have blown up an El Al aircraft. A great many people were aboard, including a large number of Americans. We knew during that period that the person involved, who was caught, the man who was giving her the bomb, had pointed a finger at the Syrian embassy, but it was only with the trial, because of the very strict British judicial system, they were unable to share, even with us, all the information they had until the trial itself. I believe the reason being that it would have the case would have been thrown out of court, they would have lost their ability to prosecute if this had become general knowledge. But what did become general knowledge was leaked, I think, to the press at the outset. In any case, as we saw this trial coming in October, there was considerable concern, and our British colleague in Damascus was beginning to pack his bags because it was quite obvious that at the least the British were going to be obliged to send the Syrian ambassador home. It was assumed then, of course, the Syrians would expel the British ambassador. That was the way it looked up until the very last minute, when Margaret Thatcher, in a move that's so typical of her, a very decisive move, when the verdict of the guilty verdict, it was not a verdict against Syria, it was a verdict against the person who had provided the bomb, but Syria was involved. When that verdict was handed down, she broke diplomatic relations. In support of the British, and also as an effective way of putting pressure on the Syrians, should take a strong step. Withdrawing the ambassador is a very public way of doing it. It doesn't, in some ways, it doesn't make that much difference, but symbolically, it's very important. So that is how I happen to be back here and with you. All of 24 hours to get packed and to get out. For the last little conversation with the foreign minister as I came back here. At that time, not knowing how long it would be. Well, we consulted allies and others and set about to try to devise a policy and a series of sanctions that would be adopted by some countries other than the United States. In dealing with terrorism, it's always been frustrating that each countries tend to be bought off by the terrorists rather easily. One way is to broker some kind of deal which makes the territory of a given country exempt from terrorist acts if that country will do such and such, release so-and-so or whatever. And there have been a lot of this. There's been the Barbary Pirates thing all over again. Everybody has been making his own deal. We did manage, it wasn't easy, we did manage to get some sort of a joint position out of the EC countries. They did not agree to withdraw their ambassadors, but they have held down on high-level visits. Aid has been, any new aid has been has been stopped. Visits of high-level Syrians to those countries have been set aside. In our own case, we unilaterally cut the staff of our embassy by 1/3, cut down some of the services we provide, we require Syrian nationals to wait for security clearance for visas. That is where we were in early November. And then came the Iranian affair. And Syria was wiped off the scope by that, really. I remember when I first got back, everybody wanted to see me. I was just about ready to have a long series of talks with people over on the Hill. All the congressmen wanted to hear about what we were doing about Syria. Iran came, and there was only one subject anybody wanted to hear about, and I wasn't the one to tell them. So, maybe this is good. I don't know. Sometimes it's better not to have a spotlight on a foreign policy issue. We have made clear to the Syrian government on a number of occasions and through a number of channels, and so have other countries, that their involvement in terrorism was not acceptable to ourselves, or we believe to the international community. The Syrians have stonewalled on the question of involvement, particularly at the beginning. There was a little less conviction in that now than there used to be as various returns come in from Rome, Vienna, Karachi, Madrid, not always pointing to a direct Syrian hand, but often operatives who have stopped in Damascus or have had some facility that required, we believe, at least Syrian acquiescence. We have been able to register that since Karachi, and that was in September, there have been no acts of terrorism that we've been able to monitor. So, up to that point, we would give the Syrians, maybe a C mark. They have, something has been done. We don't know how. We don't know what kind of orders were given. But the fact is, there hasn't been any. Hafiz al-Assad himself has always denounced terrorism. And this is not just a semantic thing. His definition of terrorism is not far from our definition. I suppose if we got to some of the specific instances, there would be some we disagree on. But he agrees that hostages, airport bombings, planes, hijackings, action of that sort outside the territories, what he would call the occupied territories, are not legitimate as those of terrorism. And he's publicly said this. How do you square this with Syria's record? I don't have the answer to that. Each person can have his own opinion. But I think that it is those who felt that it was inconceivable that this could happen without Hafiz al-Assad knowing about it are less sure of themselves now. I just leave it at that. I don't say he didn't know, but I don't think we have any evidence that he did. He did have a serious illness several years ago, heart attack. He has other health problems. So he has not kept the same schedule that he used to keep, and it's possible that something's happened that he doesn't know about. Now, where does this leave us for now and the future? Well, we have a chargé d'affaires, a very able chargé d'affaires in Damascus. We have a streamlined embassy. He is not able to deal at the highest levels, but he can get messages through if necessary. The dialogue can continue as issues are important to one side or the other, but it's very hard to go much beyond discussing things. It would be very hard, for instance, without a somewhat better relationship and maybe, certainly the ability to send higher level emissaries to Syria. It would be very hard to get into a really going peace process. So this is a problem, and if we could find the proper reason, the proper justification, there could be some move back toward a normal relationship, provided, of course, that Syria stayed out of the terrorism business. Meanwhile, I forgot to mention that 2 oil companies, American oil companies, are being asked to withdraw from Syria. So we're paying a price for the principle that we've laid down. In the future, I don't have the crystal ball. You know, the question of the health of the chief of state. As I say, there have been problems in the past. People watch him. Some days he looks better than others. But he's functioning fully, maybe not 20 hours a day as he used to, but maybe 12. The economy is in trouble. Who knows where that will go? It doesn't seem to be getting any better. They're deep into Lebanon. They don't like to send military force in. They like to exert influence indirectly if possible. They have responsibilities there now. They have a large force in Beirut. Who knows what will lie ahead there? They have problems with Islamic fundamentalism. Hezbollah, the ally of their ally, Iran, is their adversary in Lebanon, where the Syrians want a secular, modern type of state, while the Hezbollah wants an Islamic republic. The successor regime, I don't know. If the president of Syria disappeared from the scene through natural causes, I suppose a group of the Alawi officers would gather together, form a junta of some sort, at least initially, and retain power. So we would not see a great change in the way Syria is ruled, but I suspect that there would be considerable change in the style, and I for one believe that personalities have a lot to do with policy. I think there would be some policy changes. I can't say what. So that takes us up to the present and time for some questions.
The ambassador will answer questions until 10 minutes after you set. Yes, sir. Could you comment on the influence of Moscow on Assad, both economically and militarily?
That is a subject I should have put into the basic. Yes. Syria is often identified as Moscow's #1 ally in the Middle East. Well, if that's the case, I don't think we have to worry as much as we used to worry about Moscow and its allies, because I think they have a rather troubled relationship. It is basically satisfactory, I think, from the Syrian point of view, in that they received a lot of military equipment, which is the main thing coming their way from the Soviet Union at very reasonable prices or credit terms. The Soviets, for their part, have a country which is compatible on many issues, which will twist its policy on something that's not of primary importance to it, such as Afghanistan, one of the few Arab countries which has rather quietly supported Moscow, or at least not opposed, and you might say this is the price of the military equipment. But there's very little warmth in the relationship. The Syrians and the Russians don't have any cultural affinity. You might say they don't, or they shouldn't with the Christian West, but in a way they do, because they are, after all, on the Mediterranean. There is a strong Christian element in Syria, particularly in the cities, in Aleppo and Homs and Damascus. There is a great respect, I think, for the United States. There is much criticism of American policy. The Syrians see the United States as the supporter of the enemy, Israel, and for that reason, on a policy level, they're against it, and they prefer the Russian position. But other issues, the Iraq-Iran war, the Soviets and Syrians do not agree. Soviets would like to see it end, tilt a bit towards Iraq, if anything. On the Palestinian issue particularly, the Soviets would like to see a unified Palestinian movement. Maybe they don't have any particular love for Arafat, but they recognize him as the leader. The Syrians are trying to split the whole thing up. So that when they do get together, and there's rumors now that it's about time for another Assad visit to Moscow. I think it's been several years since he's been there. It's very likely the agenda has as many problem areas as it has areas of agreement. I'm not trying to belittle this relationship. It exists, but it would be a mistake to call Syria a Soviet surrogate.
Yes, sir.
One question, I just want to make note of what I'm sure is an unintentional misstatement on your part. You mentioned the land that we now know as Palestine. I'm sure you didn't mean to ignore the 1948 partition. The land that once was Palestine was divided 75% for Arab Palestinians, 25% for Jewish Palestinians. Just wanted to make that remark. You teased us in your opening working in front that the thing that remains something to carry off the wrong question. I feel mixed signals from you when one breath you're saying Syria was involved with the incident in England, Syria supports terrorism, in another breath Assad, policy of Syria of the policy of Assad, in another breath Assad, the war with the conflict statement, and announced terrorism. My question is, first of all, if I could get a more clear direction of what you feel, especially in light of the recent State Department report, which clearly says Syria still supports terrorism, blames them for the murder of the Jordanian citizen of Turkey. Just yesterday, 18 weeks ago, Dick Murphy, briefing President Carter, saying that there is no evidence that Syria, in spite of allegations and Britain's history, has cut back one iota from the support for terrorism. Is the State Department doing anything, is our government doing anything anyway, to perhaps pressure Syria to cut down on the terrorism, especially because he's doing the fact that terrorism is doing people were
Well, you've given me a lot here to my reference to, maybe I didn't have my tenses right. The reference to Palestine was talking about within the Ottoman Empire, the different divisions, and of course that area is not referred to as Palestine now on any map. It's modern frontiers. You have very well illustrated, I think, the anomalies of this whole thing. If it doesn't seem to be consistent, it's because the facts are not consistent. I tried to emphasize that the Syrians on the one hand this, and on the other hand that, and how do you bring this all together? Do they have a coherent policy? Well, they probably think they do. I thought I had his positions, but how do you explain all this? On hostages, helpful because they have a certain humanitarian tradition, particularly the chiefs of state usually do take the high road, and I think they tend to mean it. They derive satisfaction from doing things of this sort. So they are trying to be helpful. Terrorism it's very hard to understand how they could have become involved in all these operations. Now, most Syrians are unaware that this is happening. It's being run by these very secretive organizations, in fact, largely one, Air Force Intelligence, as far as we know, has been the conduit to Abu Nidal and others who have been engaged in terrorism. What has the United States done? Well, we have been at the forefront of trying to put pressure on Syria. This whole thing, the sanctions, as I said, we penalized two oil companies. I don't see any Europeans doing that. We withdrew an ambassador. Maybe that wasn't a big sacrifice, but we reduced our embassy. We are depriving ourselves of certain types of contact that normally we would like to have. We have also mounted a kind of campaign, you might say, to try to get others to do it. All this for the purpose of making the balance sheet for the Syrian leadership clear that support, continued toleration of Abu Nidal and those kind of people is going to be on the negative side of the balance. when they start weighing it, and that divesting themselves will be positive. This has not yet brought about the removal of Abu Dhabi. I mean, you talked about the briefing that Dick Murphy gave Jimmy Carter. I didn't know that was in the press. I would imagine that he told Jimmy Carter about the same thing I did, that it is true that Syria has not taken any definitive action against, for instance, the Abu Dhabi organization since we put these pressures on them. In fact, one of the reasons perhaps why they are not doing it is, characteristically, Assad does not like to knuckle under, or to be seen to knuckle under pressure. They have, though, and I'm sure he would have told Jimmy Carter, they have refrained or given some kind of signal that there should be no more Syrian influence or Syria as a logistic base, terrorist act. I don't know how they can enforce that 100%, but they've done pretty well. This doesn't mean necessarily that they will cease their vendetta within the Arab sphere. You mentioned Jordan. There's been no problem between Syria and Jordan for the last year and a half since they've mended fences. King has been in Damascus several times, and there were some fairly minor but troubling incidents involving Abu Dhabi and others into Jordan, but that all predated that rapprochement.
Rabbi Maristak.
You made two comments that are somewhat curious, unrelated to one another. In a somewhat casual tone, at the beginning of your remarks, you said that Syria was not a threat to Israel. And I'm wondering, in light of missile emplacements in the Bekaa Valley, it used to be there by virtue of Syria's presence in Lebanon, and by virtue of Syria's desire to achieve military parity with Israel, don't you see Syria's presence in Lebanon today, ostensibly as a peacekeeper, don't you see that as posing a greater threat to Israel down the road? That was number one. The second comment is, what kind of humanitarian could Syria's leader be if in 1982, if I'm not mistaken, he was allegedly responsible for the murder of upwards of some 20,000 citizens of his own country in the city of Hama, trying to put down some religious turmoil.
I'll start with the last one. I don't want to be flippant, but I think that was simply a security matter handled in traditional Eastern fashion, effective. He has not had a revolt by the fundamentalists, a successful one. The Shah has. The Shah didn't want to shed blood. He's out. Hafez al-Assad is still there. I'm not justifying this, but as a practical matter, it seems to have been effective. I wouldn't call it humanitarian. Now, back to the military balance and the military threat. This is an important issue, and I maybe treated it too casually, but I was waiting for this question to come up. I didn't expect it to pass the way I presented it. I don't know of any military authorities right now who credit Syria with either the intention or the ability to inflict serious, other cases, to prevail over Israel in a military confrontation. I don't think in Israel that is the perception. There are times when budget comes around when military organizations credit the adversary with a little more than he really has. If I were an Israeli, I would not take my eyes off Syria. Syria is the only country right now on Israel's frontiers that poses any kind of a threat. So, quite naturally, if you're a military officer, a military planner, you're planning for the next war with Syria. That doesn't mean that there's any reason why that war should necessarily occur. We don't detect any real warlike impulses or intentions on the part of the Syrians. Nobody in the press or anybody else ever called for retaking the Golan Heights by force. I don't think the regime would allow that kind of talk. It would be too dangerous. They don't want to be pushed into that kind of war. The military balance is agreed by everybody that I know is overwhelmingly on the side of Israel at the present time, as long as you're talking only about Syria. You're not throwing Egypt, for instance, into the equation. The missiles that were placed on the borders are, in fact, defensive missiles. Now, you can always argue about defense and offense and the lack of difference, but if the Israeli planes don't fly over Syrian or northern Lebanese territory, they won't come within range of those missiles. So there's no threat to Israeli planes flying over Israel or even over southern Lebanon. Now, true, the Israelis were enjoying for a while just running up and down the Bekaa Valley, but I don't know whether under international law that is quite right. The Syrian move is almost the least that you could expect the country to do after the humiliating shoot-down of two of their fighters as they were turning over Syrian territory, as they were turning away from two Israeli planes. The Israelis were a little quick on the trigger there. I don't think it was a political decision. It was one of those operational things. I think they had orders that if you get within a certain distance, you can shoot. And they got within that distance and they shot. But it was that rather provocative move by Israel that brought about what the Syrians would say, defensive move. Now, that doesn't mean we were not concerned about that. We saw the dangers, we, the U.S. government, saw the dangers of escalation, of unintentional conflict, and there was an intense round of diplomatic activity at that time to calm everything down. The Syrians who temporarily actually put some missiles into the Bekaa, into Lebanon, took them out. Israel stopped complaining. They flew their planes a little further over, and we are back to another kind of status quo, which I think is satisfactory. The strategic balance that the Syrians talk about is one of those programs that I think is kind of a substitute for doing something really hostile and belligerent. It doesn't take much to say that we want a policy which will build up our armed forces so that they are in a position to confront the potential enemy, et cetera, et cetera. Does this create a threat? Well, that's for the Israelis to look at carefully, but as the Syrians increase their forces or their number of planes, the Israelis increase the quality of theirs and the numbers and so on. Nobody really believes that the Syrians are achieving strategic balance, equilibrium, as they say. But it's part of building up morale and giving them some kind of a goal to work towards.
Yes, sir.
What you justify in response to the previous question in varnishing the old Eastern culture with one brush, saying that he does with an Eastern stuff? Would you say that things are not in the East? Or do we have to cite a few more examples of that?
I didn't quite get that.
In response to the previous, in this sector, that he dealt with dealing with the 20,000 people, he dealt with Eastern pattern.
Well, the East. Oh, that was a very
The white brush that you're talking to whole people.
No, I was being not entirely serious with that comment, but there is a tradition, if you read history, for solving security problems, and by the East I didn't mean much further east than Iran, perhaps, for direct action of that type, removing the problem militarily or whatever. Sometimes the people doing that came from the East, from the Turkish tribes, and we can get into this history. It's very interesting. Kulagu, Genghis Khan, Tamerlane. The last time Damascus was destroyed was in 14 250, well, I don't know my name, what it was, but it was Tamerlane, the Lame, who came in, and he left a few things. Fortunately, the great mosque is still there.
Mr. Ambassador, for our children and our children's children, what would be your personal blueprint for peace if you could write out a peace proposal for the Middle East and head up the peace mission?
Well, I of course, won't give you a comprehensive answer to that. It's too big and too vast a thing. But I think the United States government, over the years, since 1967, particularly when Israel expanded beyond the initial borders, has based its policy on Resolution 242 that we all know, that is an exchange of territory for peace. We never defined exactly what territory, and of course that's going to be the real problem if it ever gets to that. But the answer in the long run is for the Arab states to become accustomed to and to accept the presence of Israel in their midst, and for the Israelis to be in some kind of recognized frontiers, and of course for the Palestinians to feel that they have some say in the area that they are interested in. As we all know, there are territorial disputes that remain, but there are plans that should be put on paper that would appear to most of us perhaps to be fair. In the long run, who knows what will come out of this? But in the time that I have been observing the Middle East, starting in 1951 when I first went to Syria, I have seen a gradual lessening of the conviction that Israel must be removed from the area. This is on the part of the Arabs. Even Syria now is willing to give Israel a place in the Middle East, secure borders. The Syrians say they're not ready to exchange ambassadors, to normalize, and all that sort of thing. I don't know of any government in the Middle East, I don't know about South Yemen, but I don't know of any government which is calling for the elimination of Israel or whatever. Now, we had that kind of thing before 1967. The Syrians were among those who felt that Israel was a temporary phenomenon, and that there were various kinds of pressures like they were a few years ago. There's some intractable problems. The people governing certain countries out there, not all of them are ready for the kinds of compromise that would be needed. Neither side is going to be able to get all at once. The Palestinians' problem is compounded by the fact that you don't know who the Palestinians are now. Maybe that could be an advantage under certain circumstances. It makes it easier for the Israelis, for instance, perhaps to deal with some Palestinians who are not frontline PLO. I think the elements are there for an effort. We'll see what comes out. There's kind of a renewed interest. But King Hussein wants peace, we know, and on, I think, reasonable terms. The Egyptians, the major players do. And Jimmy Carter has just been in Damascus. He seemed to detect some flexibility on the Syrian part. Well, this we have to see. We have to know more about that.
I'll have to have just one last short question, Mr. Jacobs.
A much smaller question, as part of the larger question that you just answered. What in 10 years do you see as the future for Lebanon? Is there any possibility of a recreation of Lebanon in any discernible, governable, manageable nation? And if so, what would that shape, form be?
I wish I could see that, or anything really, in the crystal ball for Lebanon. Realistically, it seems that the most likely future, near-term future, will be a continued kind of cantonization with each sect which has a military force controlling its own area de facto, with an umbrella government that has some authority one place or another. In other words, more of the same. Now, if the Syrians can hold the lid on, if they can reduce the cycle of violence, this might bring some of the old political forces into play. One would like to dream of the old Lebanon as the compromisers and the Sunnis and the Christians and the others getting together and for the good of business and trade and so on, everybody working something out. But too much blood has been spilled. The politics and military power is now in the hands of an element that is not the traditional ruling element of Lebanon, the people out of the street, the people who never worked a day in their life except to carry a gun and shoot somebody. How you reverse all that, it's a very difficult thing. It almost requires something like a Syrian army in there just to stop them from killing each other. I don't have the answer, but those are some of the elements I'm afraid that we're going to be seeing there in the future.
I have to apologize to those of you who still have questions. I think we've squeezed as much time from the ambassador as we dare.